Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Access to Housing and Distribution between Neighborhoods from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about accessibility and affordability of housing facilities in urban areas. We will also discuss about the costs and benefits of accessible houses. Rapid urbanization places remarkable strain on housing and serviced land. By 2030, about 3 billion people or about 40% of world's population will need proper housing and access to basic infrastructure and services such as water and sanitation systems. This translates into the need to complete 96,150 housing units per day with serviced and documented land from now till 2030. Unfortunately, especially in the developing world, supply is often limited by inadequate governance systems and human resource deficiencies, as well as by institutions and regulations which are either obsolete or lacking in capacity or are poorly informed. So far, the failure of urban planning and the construction sector in matching the demand for homes has resulted in a huge housing backlog that has led to the development of slums in a variety of contexts globally. On the other hand, the cities of the developing as well as the developed countries are also witnessing the continuous process of gentrification of the cities. So with this big background, we can now discuss about the objectives of this module. This module aims to throw light on increasing housing requirements in near future, accessibility and affordability of housing, the distribution of neighborhoods, the demand and supply side of housing and the general equilibrium, access to luxury residential market, benefits of accessible housing and the cost of accessible housing. There is a broad consensus on the fact that housing has central importance to everyone's quality of life. Housing, besides being a very valuable asset, has much wider economic, social, cultural and personal significance. The way in which housing is produced and exchanged has an impact over development goals such as equity and poverty eradication. However, with the current rates of urban growth and the inability of housing delivery systems to cope with the need in developing countries, the housing crisis is likely to increase in the future. It is estimated that in the next 2 decades, about 35 million units need to be constructed annually to accommodate newly formed households and replacement of inadequate units in urban areas. In other words, about 95,000 housing units need to be completed daily in the urban areas of developing countries. Roughly 2/3 of this need is estimated to take place in Asia and the Pacific region, some 16% in South America and Caribbean, 11% in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 8% in North Africa and the Middle East. Africa, being the least urbanized but fastest urbanizing continent, has, needless to say, a great challenge in improving housing conditions. Thus, under conditions of scarcities, there are chances that the distribution of the neighborhoods is unequal. Hence, the government's responsibility increases not only in creating more of the affordable houses but also in ensuring equity. Accessibility and affordability. In simple terms, affordability means people's ability to purchase a particular commodity within its income level. In this sense, affordable housing generally means that total costs, that is, rents, mortgages, basic utilities, and maintenance, of appropriate housing total less than 30% to 35% of a household income. The term affordable housing sometimes refers to subsidized social housing for people with special needs, that is, people with physical or mental disability, severe poverty, etc. But that is actually a minor proportion of total affordable housing demand. Most affordable housing is occupied by low-wage workers, students, and people living on pensions who pay unsubsidized rents, sometimes called workforce housing. The figure shows various affordable housing needs ranging from a small group that needs emergency shelter or subsidized housing to a much larger group that needs affordable rental or owned housing. This can be illustrated through the triangle given in figure 1, which shows that at the tip of triangle, fewer people are there who would be demanding affordable houses for emergency shelters. A large group at the bottom of the triangle includes the low and medium income households who demand affordable housing due to their lower savings and lower capacity to purchase. The accessibility refers to ease of reaching goods, services, activities, and destinations. Various factors affect housing accessibility. These are mobility, that is the ease of physical travel, transport options, that is quality of walking and cycling conditions, rideshare and public transit services, automobile transport, car sharing, and taxi services. Connectivity, that is connections among roads and paths and therefore the directness of travel. The prices, that is public transit fares and the cost of vehicle ownership and use. Land use accessibility, that is the geographic distribution of services and activities. The user information, that is the ease of obtaining information on transport options. Residents of more accessible housing tend to own fewer vehicles, drive less, and rely more on walking, cycling, and public transport. Increased accessibility tends to reduce transport cost and improve economic opportunities, that is shopping, schooling, and employment, particularly for people with disabilities and low incomes. It is therefore important that affordable housing be available in accessible locations with some units designed to accommodate people with disabilities. Table 1 compares transport options and costs for a typical moderate income two adult households. In a very accessible location, the household requires no vehicles and has low transport costs. In a moderately accessible location, it owns one vehicle and has moderate transport costs. In an automobile-dependent location, it owns two vehicles and bear high transport costs. For low and middle income households, both the affordability and accessibility are important. If the affordable houses are located in less accessible areas, the daily time cost and transport cost would be higher, affecting the affordability of living in a low-cost housing area. Thus, the households need affordable as well as accessible housing facilities. The affordable accessible housing refers to adequate quality housing, affordable to household budgets, located in accessible locations where a vehicle is not needed to access common services and activities. So, lower income households can spend less than 45% of their total budget on housing and transport. It typically consists of basic low-rise, that is of 2 or 4 stories apartments located in neighborhoods with commonly used services, that is stores, schools, healthcares and parks, a good walking and cycling condition, and high quality public transit service. Such houses have these features. They are inexpensive but adequate housing, which cost less than 35% of household budgets. These are energy efficient, that is, they reduce cost and maintain comfort. Some units designed to accommodate people with disabilities. Accessible location, that is, commonly used services located within an easy 10-minute walk and numerous jobs located within a convenient 30-minute transit trip. This includes affordable food stores, coffee shops and restaurants, medical and dental services, schools, parks and recreation centers, and public transit. These should be multimodal, that is, high quality walking, cycling, public transit, car sharing, and taxis. The universal design, that is, transportation facilities and services accommodate people with disabilities, affordable telephone and internet services, unbundled parking, that is, the households are not forced to pay for parking spaces they do not need, and transportation and housing total less than 45% of the household budgets. The distribution of neighborhoods. As we have discussed, that the low-cost housing is generally more in demand if it has reasonable degree of accessibility. However, we can easily observe spatial inequalities in a city whose major determinant is the level of income of the households. The rich or high-income households may choose to live away from the urban centers as they have sufficient capacity to bear the transport cost on the routine basis, but the same is not true for low and middle income households who prefer to live near the urban centers if the housing facilities are affordable enough. The distribution of low-cost neighborhoods largely depends upon the demand as well as supply of these housing facilities. Major demand drivers and supply constraints of affordable and accessible housing facilities are shown in Figure 2. Rapid urbanization leads to migration of the people from rural to urban areas, resulting into increase in demand for housing facilities. The rising income levels also raise the demand for affordable housing, as with increased savings, people may wish to shift from rented houses to owned houses. The housing demand may also increase due to increase in longevity. As life expectancy increases, people remain in their homes longer, reducing the supply of properties available to new households. The housing demand also increases due to rise in nuclear families and single-person households. On the other hand, the supply side constraints include the availability of land and financial and regulatory support to purchase the house. These are the major issues in developing and overpopulated economies. Land cost is another crucial factor affecting supply of land. Given limited availability of land in urban areas, it becomes unviable for developers to provide affordable housing without government support. Lack of proper financial facilities further adds to the woes of the consumers as well as the developers of housing projects. Most of the nationalized as well as commercial banks mainly deal with the housing finance for the high and middle income group and the low income, the economically weaker sections who do not have a permanent source of income are generally excluded by these financial institutions. For the developers too, the banks do not provide adequate finance, and since the capital market is also underdeveloped in the developing countries, the cost of raising money from open market is generally very costly, which discourages many of the developers to increase investment in housing projects. Assuming perfect knowledge, rational consumers as well as the suppliers, now we can discuss the demand and supply side of accessibility to affordable housing. The demand side. As already discussed, affordable housing means reasonable housing cost in relation to income. Households can be said to afford their housing cost if those costs do not extract an unreasonable share of household budget, leaving the household with sufficient income to meet their needs, such as food, clothing, transport, medical care, education, etc. Assuming that a fixed percentage of household incomes is spent on housing, the housing expenditure, or say the demand for housing, would increase proportionately along with income as represented by OH in figure 3. A housing unit with expenditure above OH is presumed to have an affordability problem. Any housing unit having an expenditure below line OH, or if its income after housing is sufficient to meet non-housing expenditure at or above E star E star, where E star E star represents the amount needed to meet minimum non-housing needs. Thus, only those expenditure patterns that place them above E star and below OH are seen as not having a housing affordability problem. However, the accessibility along with affordability greatly influence the demand for housing that is assumed to have negative association with housing prices as well as rent. If housing prices or rents are higher, transport expenditures are higher due to lower accessibility, people are left with fewer savings, leading to lower demand for housing. The demand for accessible housing may increase due to a number of reasons. Number one, aging population. The proportion of residents over 65 years of age is projected to approximately double between 2010 and 2050. Older people tend to demand smaller and more accessible homes. The second issue is that of stagnant incomes. Real wages and incomes are likely to decline among lower income households, that is, the first two income quintiles, due to deindustrialization and global competition. The third problem is that of rising fuel prices. If fuel price rise, demand for more accurate locations tends to increase. Growing congestion. As traffic parking congestion increases, the value of more accessible multimodal locations and alternative modes tends to increase. And another factor that leads to this increase is health and safety concerns. Research indicates that urban living tends to be safer and healthier, and therefore people wish to live in the areas where these facilities are more accessible. Supply side and general equilibrium. The equilibrium in the housing market is shown through Di-Pasquale-Wheaton model. In figure 4, on the supply side, the unlimited ability of landlords to change from letting to selling or to buy property and let it out equalizes the profit from activities on the housing market and from holding other assets, which is shown by upper left quadrant in figure 4. High prices or rent induce landlords and developers, if dwellings are sold directly to the households, to order contractors to construct new dwellings, that is the lower left quadrant. The addition to the housing stock is the surplus of the construction over demolition, the latter being a fixed depreciation rate on existing stock, that is lower right quadrant. Supply is fixed in the short run due to time lag in construction, but long run supply is an upward sloping function of the rent and price, shown by upper right quadrant. The aggregate demand on a housing submarket equals the number of households living in submarkets, which can change due to household formation, mortality, and changes in residential location demand. Higher rents and prices make entry into the submarket more difficult and exist more likely, such that aggregate demand is a downward sloping function of the rent shown in upper right quadrant. Equilibrium conditions are given by the rent R star and price P star that equalize demand and supply at stock level HS star. However, in real life, equilibrium conditions may change, or the equilibrium can be achieved at the suboptimal level depending upon the rate of demolition, the nature of change in demand for housing, the developer's ability to respond to any change, as well as their rationality and frequency of changes in rent rates and housing prices. If the change in demand is temporary, the equilibrium may shift to higher prices as the suppliers would not raise the supply and the equilibrium would come back to the original position as the temporary rise in demand disappears. On the other hand, the permanent rise in demand includes the suppliers to raise the supply of housing stock, and as the marginal costs are rising, the new equilibrium would establish at slightly higher prices, that is greater than R star and P star, and higher stocks, that is more than HS star. Now we can discuss about the access to luxury residential market. So far, most of our discussion has been based upon the accessibility of affordable houses. But the neighborhoods in the urban center as well as the suburban areas are also the prime locations to the high-class luxury houses. Within the centers, these can be found in the prime property locations, but their location away from the urban center also has equal probability, as for them, the accessibility is not a major issue. Due to high income levels, they can afford to spend upon costly urban services beyond the urban service boundaries, and also have their own transport facilities to have access to center of economic activities in the city. It seems that the issue of accessibility and affordability is related with low and middle income class only. The demand of luxury houses is generally less responsive to ups and downs in the market and income levels. For example, Nelson in its 2006 study has estimated US housing demand by types and showed that the demand for the large lot in US would remain at the same level even in 2025, while the demand for low-cost, affordable and accessible housing would increase as the economy is expected to grow at the normal rate. Accessibility and economic activity. The accessible housing areas are also close to the centers of economic activities. Actually, the cities undergo several forces of concentrated and dispersed development. These forces are discussed in Table 2. An increasing number of motorists, lower transport costs, degraded urban livability, increase in number of economic activities where less human interaction is required, and increased preference for quiet, less polluted suburban living are some of the important forces that lead to urban dispersal. On the other hand, more non-drivers or fewer car other vehicle owners, higher transport cost, improved urban livability, along with the desire to live near the hub of economic activity are the forces of concentration. The forces of concentration increase activity levels and land prices towards the city center. Forces of dispersion spread out activities and reduce the price difference between urban and suburban land. This fact can also be observed from Figure 5. The figure shows that the forces of concentration, that is blue line, leads to more of the economic activity and higher land price in the urban centers, while the forces of dispersion, that is red line, lead to dispersal of economic activities to the urban edge. But the urban edges are less accessible for non-drivers and people with lower incomes. Therefore, if forces of concentration are more active, the persons demanding for accessible housing facilities also live near the centers of economic activities, while those with no or fewer accessibility, that is, those who live in the urban edge, also live far away from the urban centers. Therefore, the lower housing prices at the urban edge may be more than offset with fewer employment opportunities and higher expenditures on transportation on routine basis. Thus, the accessible housing facilities are more beneficial for the low and middle income households. Urban development patterns reflect tension between forces of concentration and dispersion. Many of the current trends described previously favor more accessible, compact development. For example, aging population, rising fuel prices, increasing traffic congestion, and improved urban livability are all increasing demand for urban housing and business location. A rational real estate market will respond to such demands by increasing the supply of affordable, accessible housing within the existing urban areas. Benefits and cost of accessible housing. The accessible housing facilities have both the advantages as well as disadvantages. Now we can discuss the cost and benefits of accessible housing. Number one, the benefits. The affordable accessible housing is the opposite of gentrification, that is, the displacement of lower income households by wealthier households as urban neighborhoods become more attractive. It allows households with diverse incomes, abilities, and needs to live together in attractive, diverse, and dynamic neighborhoods. It allows lower income employees to live close to businesses, economically and socially disadvantaged children to attend good schools, and creative people, that is, students, artists, and entrepreneurs, to live, work, and participate in a community. It is a key strategy to support social diversity and economic innovation. It helps in reducing homelessness and associated problems. This type of housing is suitable for people who are currently or at risk of becoming homeless. Affordable, accessible housing is especially suitable for seniors and people with disabilities. It increases household savings and affordability. Affordable, accessible development tends to reduce housing and transport costs, providing savings particularly for low-income households. It results in lower congestion levels. Residents of more accessible multimodal locations tend to drive less and so cause less traffic congestion. Residents can own fewer motor vehicles and drive less, which reduces parking congestion and parking costs to governments and businesses. Urban residents tend to have significantly lower, typically less than half, per capita traffic fatality rates than residents of the sprawled locations. Accessible housing is also instrumental in energy conservation and emission reductions. In such households, in such neighborhoods, people tend to consume less fuel and emit less pollution than residents of automobile-dependent locations. It also increases personal security. Increasing pedestrian traffic and public surveillance tends to increase personal security in urban neighborhoods. The accessible housing facilities tend to reduce public service unit costs and preserve open space. Since such houses are located in the heart of the city, they also ensure increased economic opportunity. More compact, accessible development also increases economic development by supporting agglomeration efficiencies. Now we can discuss about the costs. The affordable, accessible housing can also impose some costs. It may lead to smaller lawns and gardens and less access to open space. It may lead to reduced privacy and quiet. Residents of compact neighborhoods tend to have less visual privacy and are exposed to more noise than in suburban locations. Another cost is lost view and sunlight. Tall buildings often block views and solar access to the houses. It increases in some development costs. It increases some local public service cost due to increased demand for certain public services, including schooling, welfare, and public transportation. It also leads to increased transit crowding, especially during the peak period. It leads to various user problems such as slower travel speeds, reduced comfort, and increased physical effort. Besides, some affordable, accessible housing is located in areas with concentrated poverty and associated crime problems. So students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. To sum up this module, we can say that the demand for accessible housing is increasing day by day due to a number of reasons such as aging of population, rising fuel prices, stagnant incomes, etc. But there are several supply side constraints, especially the land prices and the financial system. Since accessible housing has several advantages, these constraints should be duly taken care of by the planners, aiming at equal distribution of accessible and affordable housing stock. Any housing policy should aim at the maximization of the benefits and minimization of the cost of accessible housing. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.